Hi, I'm CJ and this is my RC channel. So the next step in the assembly is step 6, which is the solid axle, and this is basically where a center diff would go, but this kit does not use 3 diffs, it just uses 2, which is nice from the point of not having to build another one of these suckers. They are a messy build, and well, they're not that messy. It's just torquing these screws in is a lot of work, and you're kind of juggling parts and getting, you know, it's one of the trickier parts of the kit for sure. So onto the solid axle, and as with most car kits, things are very well organized. It tells you right here, center solid axle assembly, and then step 6, and then solid axle bag, and here we have solid axle bag. So nice and simple. You'll find that throughout the kit, and you'll find that through most manufacturers as well. They at least have some type of system of either numbering, numbers and letters, or full-on names for organizing the different pouches with the various assemblies for you. So we've got a nice big aluminum gear, 44 teeth. We've got a couple of out drives, and which are identical again to these. This is nice that they're using a consistent part. There's only one out drive. It is going to be the same at all locations, so if you bust one of these, crack it, whatever, you're not going to have to go, oh, I need the one that fits here. It's very nice when you see things that are put together like that, where there's a consistency and an interchangeability of certain types of parts. I suspect we'll see other examples of that throughout the kit where it's feasible from an engineering standpoint to do. So I'm just going to set these diff loops off, not going to need those anytime soon. Got a few out drives, got a couple bearings, and an assortment of screws, a couple of O-rings. So let's see. We take one of our out drives, and we take one of the bearings, and just like over on the diffs, the bearing is going to go here. I'd be willing to bet all of these bearings are the same size here. That's another nice thing, that if you need to replace bearings or you're doing an upgrade kit, you're going to find they're all the same. Now, if you were doing an upgrade, you're probably upgrading to something like a ceramic bearing. So I am going to repeat that process I did on the other one and put a little bit of grease on here. Because it is a metal on metal. Even though it is probably like a bushing type arrangement, it's still metal on metal. And it may not even be an issue, because these things may not turn independently of each other. In fact, because this is a center, since this isn't a differential, I would imagine that the two out drives turn identical to each other, or in some way almost locked to each other, and we'll see as that goes. So we have to put in one pin here. There's no O-ring or washer or anything. And I'm going to go ahead and use this stand again. This stand came in very handy building the diffs. I highly recommend using one. I would hope you have one. You will be needing them. Yeah, see, this is going to be a locker front to rear, because there's a slot right here that's going to catch that pin there. So let's start with the pin here. So, okay, I see how that's going to go. I am going to put a little grease here anyway, just because this is, even though it's not going to spin in there, it still is a metal on metal part, and just to prevent things kind of fusing together. So there's a small hole here and a large hole, and the outdrive slides right in there. The pin drops into that hole, passes through, and it is retained by a small grub screw. Now this grub screw is going to anchor that pin, and I'm going to anchor it down for now. I may come back and put a little bit of blue Loctite on that. You have to be real careful. Even blue Loctite can be can be very hard to get out, especially with small things like little grub screws and stuff. You can strip the grub screw trying to get it back out again. I just made sure it was good and tight, and I don't know if you can see, but there's a teeny bit of motion here, like lash, and I didn't put the bearing on. Okay, so what I need is a pin, like a push pin. And that's why there's a hole in the bottom, so that you can get that retaining pin out if you need to. And it's being difficult. I know what I can use. Okay, got it out. Had to give it a bit of a whack. I'm going to go ahead and put a little bit of blue Loctite. That way I don't have to crank down on that too hard. Don't want to try and push the pin through the other side and lose connection there. Okay, good. Okay, so now we just those go in from the other side, I think. Yeah. Just made that nice and loose so I can get these all started, do them in a star pattern. So now I can tighten these down. Okay, and last but not least, we have these two O-rings. These are not a seal. I think they're just like a pad for the dog bone that's going to go into there. Sorry there, the battery died. And I'm not sure exactly where it cut off. I am taking those two O-rings, which are held in by grease, some of this grease, and I am just putting them in this container with them. I will put those in place when I'm doing that portion of the assembly, because if I try and do it now, I'm just going to have O-rings falling out with grease on them. So I'm just putting the diffs and the center gear assembly in this container and setting it aside for now. It's now time to move on to step 7, which is the rear assembly and requires bag number 1. And here's bag number 1, and it's also going to need the chassis. So this is a point where I'm going to be adding a modified item or an upgrade item, an option item, which is the carbon fiber upper plate for the rear control arm. So I'm going to shut off the video for a moment, and I am going to take a few minutes to just open this bag, kind of review stuff, figure out what parts I'm going to need for this section here. Look at some of these inserts and figure out which ones I'm going to use based not only on this but on the setup sheet that I'm building off of for the tuning portion. So I will pick up the video in just a minute. So here are a handful of upgrade parts that I'm going to be using. It's a different set of springs for the shocks. I'm just going to put those over here in the parts box. This is the ring and pinion gear that I've purchased, and this is a 19 tooth pinion. This is the set of carbon fiber plates. I'm going to go ahead and install these. The front ones have not arrived. I'm still waiting for those. I should have them in a day or two. These are the pistons that I'm going to be using. It's a conical piston, which means that it's taller in the center and gets narrower out toward the edge, which means the surface area that rubs against the inner wall of the shock absorber is smaller. There's less surface area, which means less friction, which means a smoother action. I've used conical pistons on various cars. My TLR 22 has them. This is the set of 1mm hubs that I'm going to be changing up for what comes stock, and likewise I'm going to be changing the sway bars. And that is all coming from a setup that you can find on the Serpent website if you're so inclined. By the time you see, depending on when you watch these videos, this is early 2002. Hopefully there'll be others. There's also a website, I can't remember the name offhand. They have a large number of setups that people have uploaded for various types of cars, off-road, on-road, all different makes and manufacturers. So I'll try to remember that and put it in the description of at least one of these videos somewhere in this series. I'm debating whether to install these at this time because since I don't have the front ones yet, I'm hoping I'm going to have them in a day or two, but it might be longer. And if I get this done in time, there may be some racing this weekend. They're trying to find a parking lot they can use. So I don't know, I wouldn't want to run it in balance. Well, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and throw them on. I'm going to gamble they get here in time. If I get to the point where I'm assembling the front, I'll go ahead and assemble them with the plastic ones instead of the carbon, and I'll just deal with it. And when the carbon ones show up, I'll switch them over. So this is a 17 millimeter wrench, and it's all plastic. Now, I was buying various parts for this car, various upgrades and things like that, and I like to buy quality. For example, the setup kit that I bought is a hoodie kit. That is the tools that you attach in place of the wheels and adjust all the angles for your suspension, camber, caster, etc. That was you know, a more expensive item, and it's certainly top of the line manufacturer. Hoodie makes some of the best stuff in the industry, or at least some of the most expensive stuff in the industry. You could argue that someone else might have something better, but they are very well known for having extremely high quality as well as price. A lot of people make these little 17 millimeter T-wrenches for your wheel lugs, and they are usually in the realm of like $30, and I just didn't see spending $30 on a fancy anodized aluminum wrench for one bolt. You know, if it's a set of wrenches, I mean, a set of wrenches like these cost anywhere from $9 to $30, depending on who manufactures them. Paying $30 for one little T-wrench, I just didn't see it. Now, this may break at some point. It's fairly solid plastic. It looks like it's solid, and hopefully it'll last for a long time. It was about $5. So $5 versus $30 when you're buying all these other parts. I mean, when you consider that the $25 that saved me, that paid for at least this set of carbon inserts. It may have paid for the carbon inserts and these shock absorber pistons. So, you know, spend your money wisely where you can, and you know, search for bargains on things, especially when you're trying to make a sum of money go as far as possible. You know, there are many things that I could have, you know, not gotten, and like, for example, a set of tires. You can get a set of tires for the difference between this wrench and or at least a pair of tires with wheels and inserts already glued together. So the money I saved is half the cost of a full set of 4 brand new wheels and tires. So again, you know, pick your battles. Now, interesting thing about this, when I was first looking at this, I thought it had kick. Kick is, you'll see on a lot of off-road cars where the front of the chassis rises up. That automatically adds caster to your front steering. And most off-road cars have a lot of caster. And it's just the environment that they race under. It's beneficial to handling. I'm not going to go into great detail about that. When I looked at this, and it's actually not, well, there may be a teeny bit of caster added here because it rises up and then flattens out again. That may be to provide a little bit more lift at the very nose, where because a lot of people race these on pavement, there's cracks in the pavement and such. You don't want to have the front end so low that it catches on things and makes the car pop into the air. So having this little bit of extra lift at the very front of the chassis kind of makes it like a ski tip. So that may be why that was done, because you can tell that this is the bottom because of all the countersinking, because all the screws are going to go in from below, and the countersunk drilling is so that the screws will be flat against the aluminum surface here. It also looks like they've got a couple of cutaways here and here for the front diff gears. That's what my guess is, that those are there for. Now, the differentials can be raised and lowered. There's several settings, certain shims that you can put in there, and depending on how you want the car to handle, you can use, put it, I think there's like 3 levels, like low, medium, high. In any event, we'll cover that and get into that later, as well as overall, suspension setup and handling for this car. Now, if we look at this section of the instructions right here, okay, here and here, these are these little inserts that go into the suspension blocks, the mounting blocks for the swing arms, and those determine how much caster you're going to have, and anti-squat in the rear, how much toe is going to be added in at a frame level. I don't think that there's any adjustment for toe in the rear outer adjustment. In the front, you adjust toe by adjusting the steering control rods. In the rear, any toe has to be added at the swing arm, or at the suspension mount to the frame or to the chassis. So that's what these little blocks are for. And as you can see with these are low, a little higher, higher, and highest. So that means that from that block, the mounting point can be raised or lowered. That's going to change the amount of anti-squat, and it's kind of like the opposite of caster at the rear. I'm not going to go into detail on that. Back here we have, starting at the far left or right, depending on which direction you're looking at it, and then you have these different settings. Now, this is a type of suspension adjustment. These inserts have become very popular. A lot of manufacturers use them. I don't remember which manufacturer first came up with them. I remember the first time I think I saw those was on one of the hoodie cars. In any event, whoever came up with it, it's a fantastic way to make the suspension adjustable without having to replace the entire aluminum block. And that's the way it used to be. These big aluminum parts, they're expensive, and they're, to buy, you'll have to buy a bunch of them to be able to change settings, is prohibitively expensive, especially for casual racers. Whereas having a handful of plastic inserts, and you really only need a couple of them, because the one that's here, let's say furthest left, you can flip it in the opposite direction and now it's furthest right. Regardless, even if you make all of these independently, it's just a molded piece of plastic. And likewise with these, they just plug in to a aperture that is the same size on all of these aluminum blocks. So you never need to replace the aluminum block to make a change to anti-squat or to make a change to toe. The front location changes. Okay, let's say this knife is the rear pivot for the swing arm. Okay, you can raise and lower the front to change anti-squat, and you can move the rear in and out to change the amount of toe. So it's a very simple system, and yet it provides a tremendous amount of adjustability. So you can really, tinker with things and pop off a block, switch the inserts, put it back on, run the car out some more laps, and see how that change is impacting the feel. Because, you can say, okay, this is going to increase anti-squat, this is going to decrease it, this is more toe, this is left toe. What you really want to find out is, how does it feel to you? And how does it change the way the car feels for you? Can you drive it faster now? So you know, testing is a huge part of professional racing. The guys will spend hours and hours out there, you know, switching parts, running laps, you know, trying to do consistent times. First, you need to learn to drive the car consistently before you even tinker with tuning. So if you're new to this, my recommendation is the first thing you do is don't try to build somebody's race spec, okay? Because that person may like, you know, a looser car or whatever. Go with the stock build. You know, if you want to grab a few extra parts like I did, you know, knock yourself out, but you're not necessarily going to know what those parts are doing for you because you haven't driven the original car. So the least expensive way to go, because these cars have so much adjustability already without you having to buy anything, start with the stock build and the recommended setup. Drive the car, practice, 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 get to the point where you can turn consistent laps without crashing or banging into anything, so that you're not losing speed to bumping curbs or you know, running wide into loose stuff or whatever. And try to do it at a time when the track is available to you, where there aren't a ton of people on it, so that you don't have the interference of other drivers as well. If you can, you know, take some, you know, big plastic trash can lids or something like that. I actually was used to take this little car I have. You may have seen it on the shelf. It's a little loosey truggy, and I took some red plastic plates, and I had a bunch of old CD-ROMs that, you know, I didn't use anymore. Some of them were old software, some of them were you know, like music I'd gotten tired of, whatever. But I taped one of them on the bottom, on the inside, so that I could flip the plate upside down and have like a corner marker, and I'd go to a tennis court or an indoor parking lot and, you know, put a bunch of them out and kind of lay out a little track, and then just practice and just drive. There's nothing like stick time to improve your feel, and even if it's a different car, you're still, you know, getting used to gas brake, you know, braking into turns, finding that, you know, right speed for the turn. You're still learning. But ideally, you want to practice with your race car and get to the point where you're doing consistent laps. So once you can do consistent laps, then you can start testing. Then you want to be keeping an eye to what the car is doing. Am I spinning out in turns, or am I pushing into turns? Okay, and then you can, you know, I'll teach you some stuff in later videos about car handling. If the car is doing this and you want to change it, these are the things you want to try adjusting first. These are the other things you can also try. There's many things that can give you a similar effect, but there's a cascading effect with certain items where you change something that gets rid of one trait but creates another. And so there's kind of an order of operations, the least impactful things that you can change, and versus the most impactful things that you can change. Things like changing shock tower mount position can be very confusing, and it has different effects depending on what position the suspension is at. So, you know, don't mess with that stuff right away. Do a stock setup, and then it's going to be little things like these inserts and stuff that you're going to play with to try to enhance the handling of your vehicle and make it work better for you. Sorry if that was a little long-winded. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and pull out the parts I'm going to need for this next section here, and we will continue with the build. Okay, I went ahead and put in my inserts, and I haven't anchored them down, obviously, and the setup calls for one shim. And I am setting up the control arms right now. This is what it looks like with the carbon top panel and the plastic bottom panel. And I'm going to do the same for this one. And good reason to save those little bags, as I mentioned earlier. These are the front rears, and these are the rearward rear adjusters. So now that I've got these bagged up, and these are all the ones that I'm not using at the moment, but when I'm ready to do tuning or any tweaking, I can just go to the right bag, pull the ones that I need, and I'm all set. This way they don't get lost, don't end up mixing together, etc. It makes it easier to deal with all around. So, good technique. So, as I mentioned, this one is done. Now, just to kind of get a feel for it, you can kind of grab both ends and give a little twist and get a feel there, and it's considerably stiffer with these two panels on. The difference is that by stiffening up this arm, the connection between the outer wheel assembly and the chassis means that the shock absorbers and sway bars are going to do more work, more of the work overall, versus this item here flexing. And you really don't want this to have any torsion to it. If it were flexing in a uniform way up and down, that would kind of take the place of shock absorption or add to it. But having it twist is going to give you unusual suspension geometry over the course of suspension action, and you don't want that at all. So better to use the carbon fiber, in my opinion, if nothing else, just so that you don't have that adverse effect. Because if you think about it, if this were rotating at all at this end versus the chassis, you're going to be changing the distance between the upper the suspension block out here where your axle comes through. That is going to lengthen or shrink depending on which direction this twists, which means it's going to change the rear camber angle slightly as it moves, and that is going to happen probably at the worst time. So if you're like leaning into a turn and this twists, you're going to change your camber setting on the wheel that is getting the weight at the time, and that's not something you would want. So in my opinion, I would rather have as solid a linkage as possible with the minimum amount of flex, and dial the shock absorbers and the sway bars to do what I need, and not have any inconsistencies in geometry because of torsion and flex. So now I'm just going to go ahead and put in the assorted screws here. Anytime you're screwing into plastic, sometimes I'll use electric drills like this one right here. It's a nice little Ryobi, and it's got an adjustable torque setting, which is nice, but I never go all the way down. I'll get it close, and I'll finish that last, half a millimeter or so of tightening by hand so that I don't risk stripping the plastic. It definitely, having an electric drill like that speeds up the process. Unfortunately, I don't have the right size bit for these teeny little screws. I've got a couple of assortments of bits that will plug into that. It's a standard 1/4 inch chuck, but I don't have the right size tip. That would definitely make, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So that's 14 per arm. That's 28 screws to drive in by hand. If I was doing most of that with the drill, it would be a nice quick zip, zip, zip process, and then you tighten things down by hand. Just be sure that you don't over tighten these. The whole purpose of these plates would be defeated if you strip out the bolt holes. So tighten them down firm. What I usually do is, I'm wrenching with a full hand, and when I get down to that last bit, I turn with my thumb and forefinger, and that way I'm not able to put too much force onto the tool. If I were grabbing it with 3 or more fingers, it would be much easier to over torque it and potentially pull the threads. These plastic arms, this type of plastic is definitely soft enough that you can do that, and it will happen. So be careful about that. So everything is coming together here. I just did the sway bar mounts, and got a little play there still. It just takes a fraction of a turn, like a degree or two, to get that just where you need it. So you want this to be able to move freely, but you don't want to be able to have any up and down play. The easiest way to snap these in place is to put it on top of the ball and use a pair of pliers and just snap it. Now this is kind of up to you. It's a matter of preference. I think it's an absolute necessity. That is having a reamer to enlarge these holes. It's a very subtle change. The reamer basically has these sharp edges here, and you pass it through the hole where these the hinge pins are going to go through, and that makes it loose enough to swing freely. And that's what you want. You want to be able to, I mean, you want them to be snug. You don't want any play. At the same time, you want to be able to have the arm move smoothly and freely. You don't want it to be able to jiggle, but you don't want it sticking. And they generally come from the factory tight. Having a handful of these in different sizes is very handy when you're doing builds. I've seen so many people's cars where you take off the wheels and you take off a shock absorber and the sway bar, and you push the suspension arm up and it stays there. It doesn't drop back down on its own. If that happens, you've got problems. You need the suspension to be able to move freely under its own weight. If that isn't working, you're going to have issues with the car not having a consistent neutral stance. It's going to want to stick in one position or another, and all it takes is a little bit of a variance to throw the chassis off balance. Basically, you're creating tweak, if you know what tweak is. Once you've got these in place, there's a pair of screws. It's this dark red button head screw, and it's got an Allen head at the bottom end as well as the top. So you're screwing this in from below, and this is basically your droop setting. So when this is in place, that's why the chassis flares out a little bit, so that when everything is bolted together, you can adjust this screw from above and make that head stop against this against the chassis here, and that allows you to adjust where your bottom point is, and you want that to be consistent from left to right. That's why those are there, so you can set that, and how that's going to give you your it's going to the maximum amount of droop. So that's not your ride height. If that's your ride height, there's a problem there as well, because you want the suspension to have a little sag in it. If the springs are so tight and everything is adjusted so stiff that when the car is with the batteries and motor and all that extra weight in it, if it isn't sagging a little bit from its drop point, you've done something wrong in your suspension. You need that little bit of sag, so that it's just like your car. You know, if you go up to your car and you sit on the fender, it goes down a little bit. If you put a jack under it and you lift it, the tire doesn't come right off the ground. The suspension stretches up, and then the tire comes up off the ground. And having that where the car is kind of in a float, so there's up and down movement available to the suspension. That way the car can roll and adjust to bumps. If it's all the way down and there's a dip in the terrain, the suspension has nowhere to go. The tire's just up in the air. You don't want that. Or you've got the thing rocking on 2 tires at that point, where you've got, you know, the cars literally can teeter, and that's not what you want at all. You want all 4 tires on the ground. So just bear that in mind. I highly recommend getting these. If you don't have them, I really don't recommend trying to drill those out. Chances are you're going to go too far with a drill bit. First off, it's hard to find metric drill bits, so getting something that is a true 4mm is hard to find. Even if you have metric drill bits, chances are you're going to take too much material and you're going to end up with a sloppy suspension arm. So even with the reamer, you just do a couple passes at a time. You test, you do a couple passes, you test, and you take enough material off the inside. You don't even see the shavings. It's such a small amount that it takes away. And that will give you once you've got a free floating suspension arm, you're ready to go. So now I can put these in place, and I've already bolted the front down. Now it's time to bolt down the rear. And just to show you, when these are in place, the suspension arms move freely. That's what you want. If it doesn't move freely like this, if you lift this up and it stays there like this, hanging in space without dropping back down, you've got problems. Oops. Now this is potentially a good place to use a little bit of blue Loctite. I'm not going to do that at this time because this is the initial build. I'm going to go back over the car after a test run and look for anything loose and things that are potentially at issue. I will Loctite at that time. There's some things I am Loctiting along the way that I know are problem spots, but you know, these have a long way to thread in, and once they're tightened down solidly, they shouldn't be coming loose on their own. And I'd rather risk that than having so much Loctite on there that it doesn't want to release when you try to take something off. So there we have our rear suspension. If you're not sure which way these go, you have first off these 2 little indentations here. Those are going to go toward the rear. Also, if you look underneath the suspension arm next to the adjustment bolt, there's an L or an R for left and right. So as you can see, left and right. Okay, so I'm going to review the next step, get my pieces out. I've still got 2 screws left and these 2 brackets. These are going to be the diff mounts, and they're also going to hold the front the drive shaft that comes rearward. So there's going to be an interface here to mesh up to the diff. There's going to be a pinion gear and an out drive to capture that drive shaft. So I'll get to all that in just a moment. Also, the correct height for these, you can adjust them from below. There's a hole here in the arm, and you can slide the wrench through and capture that that ball joint there, and you can make adjustments to the height of this. The directions call for 34 millimeters. You have to look carefully. The 34 millimeters is to the bottom of the control arm, so you're measuring from here to the top here. So what you want to do is ideally have a set of calipers on hand and just make it bigger than you need. Stand this upright and take your measurement. So that's all there is to it, and adjust as needed to get that measurement.
hope you enjoyed this video. Please click like and please subscribe to my channel.